That's the deep contradiction. The maximization of return on investment, which is basically a form of monetary growth, is incompatible with the very core logic of nature, which is one of stability, of equilibrium, of steady state, of reproduction, of maintenance. Exnovation is getting an old product out of the economy. When we look at greenhouse gases, the problem is we're still using planes, heavy cars, we're still eating meat. And so the challenge is not that much to invent alternatives to these, they already exist. It's to just exnovate, take them out of the economy, which is very difficult because no one is getting paid to think about exnovation. I like to define it as a downscaling of production and consumption to reduce macroecological footprints. So it's a bit like a macroeconomic diet.
Just 1 second before we start this episode. If you are a regular listener of New Wave, I want to ask you for a small favor. I'm building this show solo, and every single week I'm trying my best to bring you top founders, investors, scientists, and operators shaping European climate tech. So if you enjoy these conversations, the best way to support the show is actually very simple. Subscribe on YouTube, leave a like and a comment on this video, or if you're listening to it, follow the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. It helps more people discover the show, helps me reach bigger guests, and helps keep these conversations going on week after week. And in return for your support, I'll keep doing everything I can to bring you sharp conversation with the best voices in climate tech. Today we're going to talk about degrowth, green growth, some of the concepts that you're talking about on a daily basis. But before all of that, I'd love for you to quickly introduce yourself and some of the work you've done.
So my name is Timothée Parrique. I'm currently a researcher in ecological economics at the Faculty of Economics of the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Most of my work has been on decoupling and green growth, mostly through a report at the European Environmental Bureau from 2019, which was titled Decoupling Debunked, which actually was an adapted chapter of my PhD thesis, The Political Economy of Degrowth from 2019, which I started to adapt as a book in Slow Down or Die, The Economics of Degrowth, which is the first one. Came out in 2022 in French, 2025 in English, and currently I'm writing part 2, which is part 2 of the thesis, and then there will be a part 3, like the Dune films really, and then the trilogy will be complete.
Look, I mean, let me frame this. We quickly talked about it before, but I think both of us want to try and avoid some sort of ecological catastrophe, if arguably we're not already in one. But we probably have different approaches. Because from my side, I'm a climate tech investor. I invest in startups that are very early stage, that are bringing innovation to market. And my kind of simple framing is that if we have innovation capital and scale, we will be able to kind of solve climate change. But on your perspective, you're saying that economic growth is not compatible with ecological limits. Just curious to hear your take. What's your perspective on venture capital and climate at the early stage of innovation?
The climate crisis is only one of the dimensions of a much broader ecological crisis. So when we talk about planetary boundaries in natural sciences, that means a full Rubik's Cube of ecological problems having to do with biodiversity and ocean acidification and chemical pollution and water use, land use, and greenhouse gas emissions leading to global warming. And weirdly, climate change is not the most difficult of these crises to address. We've not managed to solve that problem, even though it's a fairly easy one.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, it's easy. You just need to stop burning coal, gas, and oil. You do this, then let's say eat a bit less meat, and then that cut on methane emissions too. And then that's fine. You use other forms of energy, and then you get yourself rid of greenhouse gases. Think about like land use, or material footprint. How can you build a building without materials? That's more difficult. Or water use. Also, it's just like we need to continue using water. There is no alternative to water. Biodiversity is also very fragile. It's not something you can have an alternative for. So, I like to remind people that climate is one of the easiest crises because there is an obvious alternative to fossil fuels, and also because that's the one we've been studying for the longest. So we've known since at least the 60s, 70s, we have a solid 50 years, we have the IPCC, so the science on it is just crystal clear. It's one of the most advanced scientific projects in the history of our species. So we have this, and that we need also to remind people that listen to us that that has not sufficed to invert the trend of global greenhouse emissions, and that has not sufficed to sufficiently reduce greenhouse gas emissions in even the richest, most advanced parts of the world. So my challenge is this. When you're an economist, what you care about is just need satisfaction. You want decent living standards for everyone on Earth, including all the population that are living in poverty today. So that's an extra challenge to bring them to decent living standards. And you want to do this without overshooting planetary boundaries. You want to do this while remaining within a safe ecological budget. And so far, we've not managed to do this. No country on Earth has managed to satisfy the needs of its population without overshooting planetary boundaries. So that's a much larger problem. And I'll just finish on this. For me, there are two ways of looking at that problem. There's the usual way of just the additive way of considering this transition. So for example, okay, we need new forms of energy, maybe some people to invent better solar panels, lighter electric cars, even tools that manage to harness new forms of energy, new materials that are just lighter, more recyclable, more modular phones, you name it. So you add stuff, innovation. But there is also another approach, which is called exnovation. Innovation is getting a new product into the economy. Exnovation is getting an old product out of the economy. So for example, when we look at greenhouse gases, the problem is we're still using planes, cars, heavy cars, we're still eating meat, we're still, heating homes with fossil fuels. And so the challenge is not that much to invent alternatives to these, it's just to, they already exist, it's to just exnovate, take them out of the economy, which is very difficult because the whole ecosystem of innovation we have right now is just focused on innovation and transition by addition. No one is getting paid to think about exnovation.
It's interesting because from where I'm sitting as an investor in some of this innovation, I'm basically looking at technologies that are going to replace the dirty technologies or the oil and gas based technologies. If we only talk about climate, I know there are other topics that are much broader than that. But the way to do that is basically to have them better, faster, cheaper, because we are in a capitalist world and people care about money ultimately more than climate, from my perspective at least. And as a result of that, you basically have only few success so far that have actually been able to replace, or at least partly replace, the old technologies that we had. I guess how do you play with that system, that's capitalism, in order for the world to kind of become greener, and play within the budget that we have, ecological budget that we have?
It won't work. There's not even a statistical possibility, not even a theoretical, not even the shadow of a theoretical possibility of capitalism being able to function within planetary boundaries. For the very reason, and that's not, a political opinion or anything, it's just a fact about how a capitalist economy function. Capitalism is based on expansion. So it's a system that is self-stabilizing through growth. The way we create money, the way we invest, the way we run companies, the way we handle our savings, the way we consume, everything is based on an expectation of growth. And if you don't get that growth, then you get a recession, the system grips, businesses, they go bankrupt, households, they go in debt, governments, they go into austerity, the whole system goes into shock. So we know this. The problem now is, and that's one of my specialties, I've been spending quite some years looking at the possibility of greening growth. We're like, okay, fair. If capitalism needs growth to be, maybe we can just get enough growth to keep capitalism stable, and then we can just green that growth, or making it as green as possible. And you can green growth on certain aspect, of course. As we've talked, there are alternatives. If you use like smaller electric cars that you share among few people, that's better than each having, a gas guzzler just for yourself. So we can imagine, of course, that there are just steps you can do. But at the scale of the reduction of macroecological footprints we need to see in the richest regions of the world, like the numbers, that they don't square. So for me, the reading of these scientific findings about the insufficiency of green growth and decoupling environmental pressures from GDP growth means that we will have to have some kind of system change, which is not that difficult to imagine because economic systems, they change all the time. Actually, they are in constant state of innovation. The real question is not whether we will or we will not have system change. Our economic system has significantly changed in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, is significantly changing right now in wartime. The question is what kind of transformation do we need to put in place so that we gain the macroeconomic agility of doing that, that jump we've not managed to ever do, meaning, a slowdown of economic activities that is not crashing your economy.
Do we need to hit the wall in order to get there? Because, I have the feeling that we're basically like, driving a Ferrari and there is a wall in like a kilometer from us and we are running at like 300 kilometers per hour. And basically, I wonder if like we need to have a moment where basically something dramatic happens. I mean, we kind of see it right now with what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz and Europe kind of reacting to the fact that basically, oil and gas, we don't really have it in Europe. So maybe it's great to have greener technologies, but do we need a moment like that in order for a system to change?
I wonder because we've been there. I mean, the oil crisis of the 1970s, when we're doing policy design for what we call sufficiency policies, so that's basically when the state steps in to try to give incentives for people to consume less of something, for example, oil. So we've seen this, incentives to do car sharing, investment in public transport, like during oil crisis in the 70s, so you could say like, well, we've been there, and each time there's a conflict, each time there's a world crisis, we face some kind of scarcity. But it seems we've not learned the lesson. Like if we had, imagine we come back to the 70s and you get hit by an oil crisis during a decade where you also discover that burning oil is warming the climate. Then you'd be like, okay, well, let's do this 10, 20 years of transformation of the productive system to phase out fossil fuels. And then, once you've done this, then your economy is much more resilient. So we've been postponing that work. So we've been like, well, we'll do it later and later and later. And now it's much more costly to do it. It's also much more difficult. And because we've been worsening the ecological overshoot, it needs to be much more urgent. So that's why it's a bit of a scary paradox. The more we wait, the more we procrastinate the ecological transition, the more difficult it becomes, and therefore the more difficult it is to bring people in, because a gradual change in the way we eat, we build, we produce, we walk, we drive, over generations or decades, people get used to that. But, the kind of reductions we're facing now, they're very difficult to put in place, even though we put them in place sometimes because of, let's say, of undesired reasons. So it can be a drought, meaning you're out of water. It can be a nuclear power plant failure, meaning suddenly not enough electricity. It can be a war, can be an embargo from an exporting countries concerning certain, macroelectronic components or rare metals. For all these reasons, we are becoming more and more used to manage scarcity. But we're not doing it for what I think is the more powerful reason. We're managing scarcity today in order to build an economy that is more ecologically efficient. So, a bit more of a preventive policy instead of just having reactive policy every year or now, like every time there's a new ecological crisis or conflict popping up.
Do you think policy is going to be the unlock for this? Because my perspective on it is, when I look at it from an investment perspective, at least for startups, I kind of try to stay away from policies. I want startups to actually be greener, faster, cheaper. And as a result, we can play with the capitalist rule, which is like, it's just a better solution. It's greener as well, by the way, but like it's just a better solution. So there's no reason why to keep on the oil and gas products. But what's your perspective on policy? Is it a real good enabler for system change?
It's a necessary part in the sense of, by policy, you mean a kind of the emergence of a rule of social organization. So far, states, governments are never at the forefront of creativity. I think that I'm not an extremist in saying this. They reflect ideas that exist in civil society, in businesses, in associations, in civil movements. And so far, it is in civil societies that have been driving the innovation concerning sustainability in general. Some of that has been mainstreamed through policies, through laws, very little of that. Right now, I would like to see more of civil society initiatives taking the lead in these exnovation. So now, why not expecting businesses to take the lead? For one very simple reason, is when you line up, right now you can measure our footprint, the macroecological footprint of an economy. You can also identify a target. You're here, you want to get here before 2030, before 2050, whatever. So you get your gap. And then you make a list of all the things your economy needs to do in order to achieve that objective. So for example, right now, a big part of this is we're consuming a lot of meat as food. And so to get there, somehow, we need to eat less meat, right? So that's one tiny project. And of course, within that project, there's a lot of different projects relating to production, consumption, habits, school, advertising, a lot of different things, urbanism. And when you do the list of all these projects, you can ask yourself, okay, which of these projects can be profitable? Answer is a very tiny part, a very small part. And that small part, like companies have already just positioned themselves on it. And that very small part that is profitable, in any case, is always less profitable than the polluting alternative.
Do you think?
Yeah, so far, it depends. If you lay it like this, like the sustainable alternative, they tend to have longer, like they're longer to mature. Your return on investment is going to be slower. So if we are still in a financial culture where we value short-term return, people will kind of tend to go for what works. Right now, fossil investment, still a very good way of making a short-term profit compared to other alternatives. Maybe renewable energy is a bit of an exception because that has become like one of the leading, investment in these kind of sustainable investment. What worries me is that who's going to do the kind of 80% of the project where there is no money to be made, and that's where we get into very theoretical economics. It's like, why is there no money to be made? Is because think, for example, of there's a power plant. It's been running like a mine, extracting metals for decades, and now there's no more metal. The mine is closed, and you need to depollute the place. You need to rewild, bring back biodiversity, make this ready for agriculture. Like, that's a cost that is enormous. If you do this, that's great for biodiversity, but biodiversity will never have money, so we'll never be able to pay you back. And the welfare gain are great, but they're very diffuse. They're being distributed for free to the local population, which again, won't be able to just pay you back at the level of a generation or even 2 or even 3, because these are very slow processes. And I don't think we have the financial instruments that allow for this investment to be made. So the only actor that can position themselves on these are states, because they're the only one that cannot, at least in theory, go bankrupt. So they can make an investment right now and be like, well, this will be, the return on investment in terms of welfare will run over 200 years. We know, the cost of action are lower than the cost of inaction. So we know actually by investing into a fast transition now, we're removing, cost of adapting to the negative consequences of an ecological crisis later. So for us as a state, which is, let's say, the one in the last resort that have to pay the bill, when everyone else, every little actor in society has managed to kind of get rid of the externality. So for them, but for many reasons today, they're in the financial food chain. States are not the most powerful actor. So even them, they now have to basically look desirable to attract money from private investors. And they can't, because there's no discourse. You can just, greenwash as much as you want. Like, there will be no return on investment. It's negative return on investments. It's basically philanthropy. The way I like to see it is rather, a huge part of economic growth happening over the last decades has been transforming natural resources and ecosystems into financial value. Now we're doing exactly the opposite. We destroy financial value to create natural resources, whereas before we destroyed natural resources to create financial value. So right now we need to locate that financial value, and we need to destroy it to transform it back into ecosystemic value. But obviously the people holding that financial value, private investors, wealthy individuals in general, in the current financial mindset, they're going to say no. They have no incentive. They have no financial incentive to say yes.
It's interesting because the way you describe it is that there's so much that needs to change in order for this vision that you have to happen. The first thing that comes to mind, and I don't want to talk politics really, but it's like, even for a state to invest in such a long-term project, like, we know politicians, they want to be elected in 5 years from now. And so as a result of that, they want to have, kind of that return on whatever project that is in 5 years from now to be elected again, right? So, like, you're basically saying, what's the alternative to the world that we have today? What's the perfect world that we could imagine that actually works out perfectly for nature?
We would need to have independent institutions, in the same way that we have international courts and central banks and, different organizations that exist beyond the state. They're not businesses, they're not associations, they're not the state. They have power, but that power cannot be corrupted by short-term interest, both from businesses and from governments. And I feel right now, nature is not well represented by any, independent third organization that, could just, when we're talking about rights of nature, that will have legal means of imposing, of sending a fine to a company that is just polluting a river, and that will also be able to send a fine to a government with, let's say, a sovereign oil fund that decides to, invest in extracting more fossil fuels. So right now we don't have that mechanism, and I think we will need it. Otherwise, we're just stuck in this collective action problem of, yes, collectively we would all benefit. And when I say all, the great majority of the world, especially the people who are poor, who have no say whatsoever in the current financial system. Most of the people will benefit from that change, but right now, because they're just so much short-term money to grab, well, then powerful actors, they keep playing Monopoly. Because that's a bit what the financial system looks like today, a game of Monopoly where the one rule is you need to just maximize your return on investment. And that's the deep contradiction. The maximization of return on investment, which is basically a form of monetary growth, is incompatible with the very core logic of nature, which is one of stability, of equilibrium, of steady state, of reproduction, of maintenance. There is no endless exponential growth in nature. And so we've been battling with this contradiction for the last 50 years. And I think now, every year when we measure the overshoot, the ecological overshoot of planetary boundaries, this is basically us getting close to a point of ecological explosion, as if we've been pushing that contradiction too much.
What happens if we get there?
Well, listening to scientists like Jan Rockström, he's giving a lot of talk, explaining the theories around tipping points, so specific ecosystems that can rapidly shift. I mean, we know about the climate because we're hearing a lot about this. You warm it a bit, and it's linear, and it's okay because the climate has some resilience. The ocean, they can keep absorbing some carbon. But after a while, you can reach a tipping point where that system is so destabilized that it cannot fall into equilibrium again. It just degrades until collapse. So that's what we call ecosystem collapse. Think about a coral reef or a fishery. Classic. You get a fishery, you can catch a few fish, it's all okay. But if you catch too many fish, then they don't have the time to reproduce. And then, a few years later, not a single fish left in the sea. That impacts the food chain. So you have what we call biodiversity collapse. And then you went from a lake that was valuable in ecosystemic term, in the sense that it produces a lot of ecosystem services. You have the fish that you can eat, and they perform a lot of stuff, like whales that absorb carbon. And now it produces nothing. So this is the equivalent of bankruptcy, of natural bankruptcy. And once you have this is irreversible. So it's very difficult then to be like, well, we're going to rebuild a lake and then we're going to reintroduce, dead species. We're going to just try to rebuild the Amazon, the Amazon forest, because these ecosystems, they build themselves on over centuries, sometimes even longer time. So again, we have a time contradiction between capitalism, which is a very fast moving system. Fast moving, let's say, rather fast expecting, when you invest in something, I mean, we're looking 5 years, we're looking 10 years max. Even if you buy governments, state debt, the average, last time I checked, like the average maturity of a debt bond, like if you buy the French debt, it's like 8 years. So it's still like very short term compared to how nature works. So this is why, I'm talking about post-capitalism. This is not just for the kink of just, wanting to transform the economy. It's just when you start listing these contradictions, then you realize that's just something has to give. So either, the ecosystems will collapse, and I think no one wants that because then the economy will collapse, or capitalism will collapse. And then something else, hence the term post-capitalism, could be thought to replace. Just a different economic system, which doesn't have to be science fiction different. Just have to, let's say, avoid these main contradiction it has with nature.
Do we have to monetize nature in order for this to work? Is that the solution?
It is a solution that has been around for a while. The problem is that we don't have much information about nature. like when I talk to my colleagues, biologists, and you ask them like, how many species do you have in the nearby forest, or even how many species do we have on Earth? Well, they don't know. They have estimation, but even just that core number. When you build a highway or something, and then you send biologists to count how many species you have. I don't know if you've been there. I mean, doing that is just such a strenuous exercise. You go there and you look at every single square meter and what kind of species are there. And then once you have this number we don't have, we would need to have it for everywhere, then you need to understand all the very complex relationships between these species that constitute, the formation. Let's say these are the factor of productions, the workers of ecosystems that produce an ecosystem service, like climate stability, or the ability of ground to clean water, or just to transport water from A to B. So to monetize it, I feel it's a bit of a risky bet, because to do this, if you monetize something, and I think the world of finance knows this very well, you need information about the thing you're trying to monetize. Otherwise, you're going to get a speculative bubble. And even though, once you've put a price on it, then you kind of need to have an interconnection of, all different ways of the people using this resource, for them to be connected through this market, so that they can communicate, the information through price signals. And I mean, for me, that sounds very dystopian as a system. I don't think it will ever work. And I think it's overly complicated, because when we look at, I just saw that number the other day. Like in France, I think 75% of emissions are concentrated by 1% of the industrial plants. Like at the local level, you're to just 1% of places, of built places, and you have 75% of these these emissions. Same thing, like if you take your personal emissions, like most of it is just the way you eat, your car, plane tickets, and the way you heat your home. Yeah, that's it. So you're like, at this point, like, to get back to the climate, it's easier to act on just basic legal rules. To be like, for example, just one rule among others. That's one I was reading about this morning that is becoming more and more popular in certain countries. It is now forbidden to do advertising for fossil fuel heavy products. Easy. You just ban it. In the same way, at some point in history, we banned advertising for tobacco and alcohol. Now, if you were to do advertising for tobacco in front of a school, they would put you in jail. Well, maybe not putting advertising for, cheap flights where you have a train alternative in front of a school is also counterproductive, let's say, in the fight against global warming. And so I feel a lot of these preventive policies to be like, we don't really know what's happening about these stuff, so we're going to just do our best to minimize our use of specific resources until we find out a workable alternative. So, for example, right now, there is no way of flying without emitting greenhouse gases. There is no alternative to fossil fuel-based planes. And anyway, within the timeline where we need to reach net zero, you don't even have the time to get to the end, the natural life end of a plane. So a company that has invested buying a new plane is not going to retire that plane 2 years after. It's going to take 30 years, so that's already too late. Even if you were to invent tomorrow, like a water-fueled plane, that company is not going to throw away its brand new plane. So now what we need to do is find a way of grounding as many planes as we can. So just reducing, our use of planes until perhaps one day you find a way to fly that is less nature intensive, and then we can resume using that mode of transport at a bigger scale.
So you're still hopeful on innovation, and you still see it as something that's quite valuable in that ecosystem?
Well, I mean, humans innovate. They do. If you mean in that ecosystem, I mean, the best innovations I've seen around have not come from, financiers and startups and businesses. They've come from associations. This is, I mean, when we look in France at the number, the millions, more than 1 million associations that we have that have been for decades or sometimes centuries working on solving social problems without the constraint of making a profit, meaning they've been touching problems businesses have never touched. And they've had to work in very constraining situation, which has forced them to be really innovative. So I think people will keep innovating, but we should also be aware that that innovation has a speed. It has a rhythm, nothing is magic. And, that innovation can also be split into inventions, so having new ideas, transforming these ideas into an actual product. And then, as we say, getting that product to replace an old product. Sometimes you can just invent something great, like the electric car. I mean, the electric car has been invented a very long time ago. But then, of course, thermic cars that just fought to keep their position of monopoly. And so maybe if back then, we had a policy to be like, wow, that new electric car is amazing. Let's create disadvantage for thermic cars. Then you shape the market for this. And maybe, if you were to do this, a lot of people that go into business schools and they'll be like, oh, wow, I've got ideas on how to make better electric cars. And then we would have had like a century of innovation for electric cars instead of just, a decade or two from a few companies, which is a very small percentage of, let's say, all the neurons you can find in the automobile industry thinking about the electric compared to thinking about heavy SUVs running on fossil fuel.
Yeah, of course. I love what you're saying about associations or NGOs, or not non-for-profit. I don't know how we call them exactly in English. What's the translation of French to English is there, but let's call them not-for-profit. Is that an example? Is that the only example, actually, maybe, of a new system post-capitalism? Is that where we should be inspired? What we should be inspired by?
I think so. But must not necessarily be an association. So if we look at, let's say, business models, and when I say business models, it's already too narrow. Let's look at just ways of organizing production. Because an association is a way of producing something just like a business, just like a state, doing public services. It's the same thing. You gather factor of productions to make something that you're going to give to someone. The different way of financing, a different way of pricing, different way of measuring, different way of accounting, but there are 3 different modes of production. Right now we have a mode of production where the bulk of production is handled by for-profit businesses. That's one of the defining feature of capitalism, let's say, the hegemony of private firms in conducting production. These has advantages and also drawbacks. But we could very well imagine, remember the Soviet Union was another economic system where the bulk of production was handled by the state. But we could imagine a third where the bulk of production would be organized through neither the state, neither the for-profit business sector, but some kind of hybrid. Not necessarily association. Let's say this is the most one legal form, but you could have also not-for-profit cooperatives, like we have in France, the économie sociale et solidaire, social and solidarity economy. So that's just one business form, and companies today, some do that. They can transition from a for-profit private corporation that can turn into a not-for-profit cooperative, doing the same thing with the same workers, with the same plant, with the same thing. It's just a legal difference, each having some advantages and disadvantages. So for me, that's how I like to consider, what we talked about system change before, is if we agree that right now we need to throw all of our innovative power on these 80% of ecological problems that are not tackled by for-profit businesses because there's no money to be made, and they are not tackled by the state because the state has no money, because the state today is pretty much dependent, we say, on economic growth, then maybe these not-for-profit cooperative. They are more agile to tackle these. At the end of the day, it's the same thing, and it's putting human and natural resources to fabricate goods and services to, satisfy needs. So it's just the way of doing that could be quite different.
Do you have any example of that already?
Yeah, I mean, in France, we have this collective of the licorne. Licorne, it's a unicorn. So you say, I mean, the unicorn is usually this very valuable startup. So I think they play on that to say licorne, and they add in other O to say licorne a bit, like, because that's the two O of coop. And within the licorne, you have companies like Telecop, which is just a classic phone company, or Enercop, which is just an electricity selling company. You have Crédit Coopérative, which is a bank. So you have all these kind of businesses which you would not recognize. I mean, they do the same service, but legally they're quite differently organized. So I think that's a very slow movement happening, but also very inventive, because these people, they are inventing new business forms where they don't have this dependency on profitability, which put them in a difficult position within capitalism, because no one wants to invest in them, because there's, let's say, no money. The legal definition of a not-for-profit structure is that you cannot distribute the profits to an individual. And so that's quite restraining. But for some sectors and some activities, you could easily argue that they're so important and connected to the public good that it's actually good to make sure that no one gets sneaky to get the money, and that all money is being reinvested. I'll give you just a concrete example for some of us listening that live in a city where housing is very expensive. Paris, for example, because the way we produce housing services in the Parisian economy is basically a minority of people have been using their savings to purchase housing, which they now rent to other. So they're getting a return on investment, they get literal rent, and that's their financial strategy. The problem is, in doing this, as inequality widens, especially wealth inequality, that extracts more and more wealth, you get housing speculation, and then that makes, the very service of housing extremely expensive. Second problem, the money, all the plus-value, the added value over time is being distributed to these individuals, and then they can do whatever they want with it. They don't have to reinvest into housing. So that's the system. Paris, we know it is very expensive housing, not the best of quality of housing in terms of ecological quality, compared to Vienna. So Vienna is a radically different system, because there is no for-profit housing in Vienna. It's just by law since 1945. Like all housing, it's either social housing managed by the state, or not-for-profit cooperative housing managed by small or larger group of people, but where all added value, all the profit made, cannot be distributed to individuals. So it can be only reinvested into the quality of housing. What is the net result since 1945? It's just that the very cheap rent. Last time I checked, I think the median rent in Vienna was half of the median rent in Paris. So cheaper rent and much better housing. They have one of the most advanced housing in the world, because they have decades of reinvestment, into making their, transitioning to doing all the installing the renewable energy that you need, all the rewilding, all the stuff that is being procrastinated within a private mode of production of housing, because individuals, they have no incentive to invest. Just, people are desperate, they'll rent your apartment anyway, so why should I invest 50,000 euros just, to make it more energy efficient?
Yeah, I love that system, because it's actually also a better service to human beings. So as a result of that, it's kind of everyone is happy and is willing to implement that system. Because, I kind of try to compare that to some of the solutions I see sometimes to try and change the world, but then there is a cost to it. Whereas that solution that you're mentioning right now, it's like, doesn't seem like there's a great cost for humanity anyway. I just want to go back to, we haven't talked about degrowth so much so far. Can you explain, first of all, what degrowth means? And is that a necessary step towards a better kind of managed, ecological world?
Yeah, for rich countries it is. So a big part of my job is to measure the macroecological footprint of a country. Right now I'm doing this for Switzerland. So you measure all the environmental pressures. That's step number one. Then step number two, you ask yourself, okay, what would be the ideal state for Switzerland to be within planetary boundaries, to be in an ecological equilibrium where ecosystems are not being put into danger. So usually that gives you an ecological gap, and then you need to translate that ecological gap into economic terms. And that's a very difficult thing to do. But again, what we can do is we can look at, for example, all sectors and categories of products in Switzerland over time, let's say in the last 30 years. And we can look at what's been happening, because what's going to happen in the next 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 years, I mean, we cannot expect miracles. So there are certain trends. So we see in certain industrial processes, there's been massive change of technology that has resulted in actual drop in emissions. And we see in something else, for example, transport, cars, planes, not much. Actually, there's been a huge increase in demand, and so emissions that tend to get stable are increasing. So that gives you an information like, well, transport, if we want to reduce the footprint of transport, we will need to act on demand. We will need what we call sufficiency policy. Basically stuff, when I say policy, don't imagine just a state coming in to tell you what to do. It can also be a kind of self-managed. The concept of policy is an actor or a group of actors deciding to do something in order to reach an objective. So you, as an individual, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, so you just dissect everything you do, for example, everything you eat, and you identify one product that is very carbon intensive, and you're like, okay, well, in order to decrease my carbon footprint, I will try to phase out this type of food by doing this. That's a policy. That's a household policy. In the same way that you can do it at the level of a company that do policies all the time in companies, sectors, group of municipalities, cities, regions, United Nations. So all these policies, you need sufficiency policies in sectors where the footprint is stable or increasing or not decreasing enough. And then you need to reinforce the efficiency policies for sectors where stuff have been, that have been greening themselves quite good. So it's the mix between these efficiency and sufficiency policies that's going to determine whether you're going to have degrowth or not. If you only need a tiny bit of sufficiency, a tiny bit of eating less meat, a tiny bit of using less cars, a tiny bit of taking less planes, and most of the gains, most of the ecological gap can actually be breached with efficiency policies, then your economy is not going to contract much. On the other side, if the efficiency gains are quite limited, and you need to have a lot of sufficiency policies, meaning you have a lot of constraint on production and consumption, then it's very likely you're going to see your economy contract. And it is that very contraction, that scenario, which is a very specific transition scenario that we call degrowth. I like to define it as a downscaling of production and consumption to reduce macroecological footprints. So it's a bit like a macroeconomic diet. I like the downscaling because it's just not a free fall. It's just now you're here and you calculate, okay, that maybe efficiency gains can get us here, but we need to get there. So efficiency gains, sufficiency, and maybe for a period of time, we will see the economy contract until it stabilizes into what we call a steady state. So see, an economy can grow, degrow, and then stabilize into a steady state.
And I feel like the COVID-19 crisis was a bit of the real test of that, kind of concept. I mean, just talking about planes, for example, most people in the world, I wouldn't say everyone, but most people, at least in Europe, were not traveling by plane anymore. So they were actually doing that sufficiency kind of policy to themselves just because of, health reasons. You didn't have the right to travel anymore. Were you hopeful during COVID that actually we were moving towards something like this in the future?
No, I wasn't hopeful. I think what we know from COVID is that, yeah, if you ground planes to the ground, they stop emitting fossil fuels. Like, it's pretty straightforward. So, when we look at curves of emissions, each time there's an economic crash, you get the 2008 financial crisis, you get the COVID, you see that's the only moments where we invert the trend. The problem is during this crisis, we sacrifice efficiency for forced sufficiency. When I say the two are absolutely necessary. And so during a recession, as we say within capitalism, we get a massive loss of faith in the future. And so people, they're not willing to invest. They're not willing to change things because you get fear of what the future is going to look like. And so what we need is basically the sufficiency we've been observing during COVID, but organized in a way that is, more equal, more democratic, and less conducing to reducing quality of life. So, more democratic people self-choosing to basically use less of the things they find less essential and most polluting. So we need that kind of self-organized sufficiency. Some people call it voluntary simplicity. Quite like it. Minimalism. Trying and that's the silver lining is that most of the research point that there is well-being to be found in this. So that must not necessarily be a sacrifice. And in rich countries, that's especially true because the one who will need to consume and earn very much less from the production that they're linked to are people that have reached what we call the well-being saturation point. It's the point where, if I buy you a 14th car, then, your mobility well-being is not going to increase. So we need kind of that sufficiency, but we also need the economy to keep functioning in the sense of, as we say, we need this movement of both people innovating and then these people cooperating with insiders, so outsiders cooperating with insiders to do the exnovation process. And when I say this, it sounds like easy, but the problem is usually we're talking about two different structures. So let's say you invest into a cool new companies producing a new generation of light modular electric cars. Fantastic. That's the product you want to innovate, you want to introduce into the economy. But the competition who is selling the heavy oil-based SUV is not going to shake hand with you and be like, cool, I'll give you my market share. Because we are, another feature of capitalism is these for-profit businesses, they compete on a free market based on their profitability. Whereas here, in terms of collective action, it would be much greater to create some kind of the collective of automobile actors, to not say only businesses, but everyone, all the stakeholders related to car mobility. And then you can make decisions together. You can be, for example, okay, guys, let's just all agree to phase out luxury SUVs from production lines. So no one can get sneaky and be like, oh, everyone stop doing this, therefore I'm going to introduce my luxury SUV, then I'll be the one holding a monopoly power over this kind of product. You see this kind of collective action? Same thing we see at the international level of if France decide to just cut emissions very fast, stop buying oil prices get down, so other people, the US, will, cheaper oil, and then we'll just, that oil consumption will rebound. That's what we call the rebound effect. So to be able, avoiding rebound effect is like 80% of my job as an ecological economist. You want to manage to locate, a natural resources you can save and make sure you save it. We call it actually, we sanctuarize it. So to make sure it's a real savings, not something that's just, the steak you don't eat or the plane ticket you don't buy right now is just being bought and eaten by someone else just in the next 5 minutes. And that's very difficult in a growing economy because you have a forever growing demand and supply of these things. Much easier if you have a shrinking economy or a steady state economy.
That was actually one of my questions for you today, and maybe we'll just leave it to that. But cooperation feels like it's the name of the game. We need governments, companies, citizens all across the world to collaborate on this. As always, as you said, I mean, it's going to be someone's going to take advantage of other people's willingness to move towards a better world. How do we enforce, I guess, that collaboration? How do we encourage that collaboration in order for this to work?
That's the biggest question of all, and I'm not intellectually equipped to give you a satisfactory answer. We need the philosophers and the sociologists and the political scientists to ponder on that. They're much better equipped than your usual economist. What I can say is that it is easier to cooperate in an economy where you have low levels of inequality. So and when I say inequality, it's not only, wealth inequality, income inequality between people, it's also power inequality within a specific sector. So we've seen it. If you enter the car market and you have like 1, 2, 3 companies that have a huge historically built monopoly, and you come here with a very small company, well, it's going to be very difficult to change things. But if you take a newer market like cargo bikes, where you don't have this kind of path dependency, that's a very fast moving market because new companies come all the time. They try stuff, it works, it doesn't work, they built on this. And I think it could go even faster if there was to be collaboration. And collaboration doesn't mean that, it all becomes one single company producing cargo bikes for the entire world. No, you can still have the healthy, groups working on different solutions. And that's where we, the kind of anarchist spirit of be like, you give groups autonomy when they want to develop new ideas. We need to keep this. But to define very long pathways, then we need to at some point agree. And so we need to create these forums. And I'll just give you a concrete example. These, like these citizen assemblies, which is basically the state creating a forum for people to innovate, to express ideas they could not express before. We need the same for sectors. So we could have a kind of, it's not a citizen assembly, it's a stakeholder assembly of anyone interested, let's say, in planes. Environmental associations, municipalities where an airport is built, workers, consumers, and then, you create an hybrid forum where for once everyone can speak together instead of pitching the interest of the consumers that just vote with their wallet, the investors that vote with their savings, the state vote by just punishing with policies. Then you can get a real brainstorm and define a path of be okay guys, let's look at the carbon budget available, what do we want to do, and then we each work on different part of the problem, but we make sure like in a band, a very large concert, that we're all kind of playing in tune.
Well, sounds like a bit of an utopia to me, but let's see. Hopefully that can happen. I'd love for a forum like that to take place and to have real conversations and alignment between all actors. But let's see if we can get there. Look, we're getting towards the end of this episode, but if people want to help, with your mission, with what you're trying to do, which is trying to push towards a better world, what can they do to help you?
Okay, here I'm going to say like the one main obstacle I find when I talk to decision makers in both private and public sectors is that there's this spirit of being in a hurry. So I think right now, people that want to help, they need to create bubbles of suspensions where we can equip ourselves intellectually, not only alone, but also in our capacity to work together. And so that can mean, that can mean for a state, for example, if you have a very important, let's say, referendum, well, just give people 1 week of paid holiday so they can educate themselves. Open universities, open every public buildings, invite every expert we have so we can have a real brainstorm. So we're not too busy working and, making the economy run. Same thing with businesses. And I think, we need people to create these bubbles of creativity. And that requires just raw time. So that's why that will be my last message, but it may seem weird to say, but we need to work less. If we want to find a solution to that problem, we need to work less so that we create space for thinking individually and, more importantly, thinking together.
I love that. Yeah, and I think it's quite reflection on society today. It's sometimes great just to step back and think a little bit about what we're doing. But look, that was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, Timothée. I'll put a link to your book and website in the description. Is that the best link that I should put in the description?
Yeah, that's a good way to start. The book is the appetizer. The PhD thesis is also online for you if you're still hungry after that. And then there will be part 2 coming up very soon.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Timothée, for today. It was fantastic.
Thank you.